All right, so potassium, as I mentioned a few classes ago, potassium is a macronutrient, so it's a nutrient that our crops utilize a lot of. Actually, nitrogen and potassium are generally the nutrient that most crops use the most of, and then they use a lot less phosphorus and other nutrients. So in soils, especially up here in the Northeast Kingdom, and if you're on river bottom soil often, you will struggle to maintain the levels of potassium in your soil because potassium does leach. If you remember back, maybe it's a couple of classes ago, I said potassium has a positive charge and soil has a negative charge. So it does hang on to the soil, but it hangs on really weakly because it only has that 1+. So it moves on to and off from the soil pretty readily. So it is more prone to being lost through leaching. So if you have light textured soils, so basically those that don't have a lot of clay in it, you can lose potassium quite easily. So even though you may be adding it every year, especially if you're putting manure on the ground, you'll look at your soil test 3 years from now and think, where did all of it go? My soil tests are always low. And it's because it does get lost through the soil pretty easily, unlike phosphorus. But it is an essential nutrient. And I think I said, maybe last week or the week before, I feel like people really focus on nitrogen, especially when they're buying fertilizers. But what I'm often seeing out in fields, especially cornfields, and even grass fields, is potassium deficiencies. They look very similar and people get them confused. Usually if anybody sees yellowing on their plants, they just assume it needs more nitrogen, which is not necessarily true, especially on some of these soil types, because you've usually put on enough nitrogen, but you're not thinking about potassium. I was visiting a farm last week, or maybe a week, 2 ago, and we were talking about fertilizing grass. And they said, oh, it's crazy where we put nitrogen fertilizer on the grass, we never get as much yield and it doesn't look as good as where we put manure. And that's because crops need other nutrients and grass in particular needs a lot of potassium. So when you're adding manure, you're giving the crop all of the things that it needs, not just one thing. Now that's supposed to go down. Let's see here. Yeah, there we go. So if you remember last week, if you weren't sleeping, there, it was the nitrogen. Yeah, put your glasses on. Thank you. Yeah. I brought mine today too.
Oh, good.
Yeah, we both see the slides this week. Last week I showed the nitrogen cycle, and if anybody remembers, it was pretty complicated. There's nitrogen coming out of the sky, there's microbes in the soil, there's all kinds of things going on. But with potassium and also with phosphorus, the nutrient cycle is pretty straightforward for the most part. Potassium originates from rocks, right? And of course you have potassium in your manure, but where it comes from is minerals. And when you're buying potassium fertilizers, it's in the mineral form. Unlike nitrogen, right? It's been pulled out of the air and put into a form that we can use, which is different than all the other nutrients. All the other nutrients come from rocks at, some point. Okay. So their cycle's way different and much easier to manipulate and to understand. So we get potassium into our system from manures, of course, and plant residues, and fertilizers. And, over time, depending on your soil type, especially up here, you got a lot of rocks, probably got a lot of rocks. Yeah. They do break down over time. They weather over time and you get some, minerals from that, but we're not going to put that in your nutrient management plan. But yeah, so mineral fertilizers in the manure, you're getting potassium from. And the potassium is in a few forms in the soil. So you have potassium in soil solution, which is kind of just a fancy way of saying there's potassium in the water, right, in the soil. So it's free and it's available for the plants to take up for their roots, but it's also, you know, can be prone to leaching. Then you have exchangeable potassium, which is this little circle here. And that's the potassium that's hanging off your negative charges on the soil. Okay. And remember, I said it's kind of loosely, I don't know if it actually is flopping around, but it's just loosely hung onto the soil, and it can move off from the soil and into the soil solution and back onto the soil pretty readily. And that's what it does. As soon as your crops start removing potassium out of the soil, it creates a deficit. And so that draws potassium off of the soil into the soil solution. So it's exchangeable and readily exchangeable. Then you have fixed potassium, and fixed potassium is potassium that's kind of stuck in between clay particles. And then you have mineral potassium, and you can see these sort of dotted lines here. That means it's slow. It's slow to be made available. And it does sort of go in different directions, but it takes more time for those things to become available for your plants. So when we take a soil test and we're measuring potassium, we're looking at what's exchangeable and what's in the soil solution. We're not really accounting necessarily for everything that's there. We're trying to account for what your crop is going to have access to. All right. So again, here's the forms of potassium. So you have the primary minerals, like I said, that's most of the potassium in the soil. It's unavailable. It does weather and break down over time, but you know, it's not something that we account for on a soil test. Then you have this like stuck, I call it stuck potassium. It's really slowly available, and it gets stuck in between the layers of clay. If you looked at clay under a microscope, you would see that clay is just these sort of layers, and they kind of stack on top of each other, certain clays. And then in between those layers, nutrients get stuck and potassium gets stuck in there. And it does come out, especially the stuff that's kind of around the edge, but it's much more slowly available. Then you have the exchangeable potassium, again, what's hanging off the soils, and then the solution potassium, okay? So this is really what your crop has access to. Okay, so here are potassium deficiencies, and you can see these in corn, kind of starts at the lower leaves here, but most people see that and they think it's nitrogen, you know, oh, my crop needs nitrogen. So, you know, usually with potassium, you see this kind of on the margins of the leaves. You can see it here in soybeans, and then in alfalfa. Alfalfa uses a lot of potassium, so doesn't corn. And it starts at these margins here, and it kind of works its way in. And then you can see this browning here, which is different than nitrogen deficiencies. So again, just make sure if you're seeing this, you're treating the right thing, not just putting on more nitrogen. That actually makes the situation even worse, to be honest. Okay, now with animals, we often get concerned about high levels of potassium out in the field, because often that leads to high levels of potassium in our forages. And then we have to be careful who we feed those forages to, because we can end up with things like milk fever, right? And especially up here, somebody will always ask me this question. Well, my soil test says that I'm low in potassium, but my forages are still high in potassium. What's the deal, right? So again, when you apply manure to your fields, you are putting on roughly 20 pounds of potassium in every 1,000 gallons. 20 pounds, it's quite a bit. And all of it is available to your crop. So even though you put that on, your crop is definitely getting a lot of it, it's not building up in the soil over time that it'll then reflect on a soil test. So just because the soil test is low doesn't mean you can't end up with high potassium forages, which a lot of people do because you keep adding potassium and you're losing it, you know, and some's going into the crop. All right, and then for farms that are grazing, also, if you have really high potassium soils, not really low, or in both cases, really high potassium soils, what happens, I don't know if that's the next slide. No, no, no. What happens is, I don't know if everybody remembers when we showed the cation exchange capacity. Remember, we had all the negative charges on soil and there was calcium on the charges, right? There was magnesium and there were potassium. Those are the bases, cations. So if you have a lot of potassium, I mean a lot, and let's say your pH is low, so your amount of calcium is really low and the amount of magnesium is really low, then there'll be a lot of potassium on those binding sites, which also means you'll be limited in magnesium and calcium in those forages, not just in the soil, which again can lead to grass tetany in the spring, as an example, because the crop isn't getting enough magnesium and it's getting a lot of potassium, right? All right, so people that grow legumes and alfalfa, which I use alfalfa as an example here, because alfalfa and some of the other legumes too, mostly red clover, I guess I would say, not necessarily white clover. They have these big tap roots, and those big tap roots and the crown up above that you see here really help to help overwinter alfalfa. So they'll build up a lot of potassium in those root systems to act sort of like a antifreeze. Okay. And that will protect the alfalfa root, that big succulent root and crown. Not that we've had a lot of cold weather this winter, but we're about to, right? One day, but nonetheless, you know, there's a lot of years we have many days of that kind of weather. And so potassium helps to reduce the risk of winter injury in alfalfa. It also requires a lot of potassium to function properly, and the bacteria that have its association with the alfalfa. So it removes quite a bit of potassium if you're growing alfalfa. And so the recommendation for legumes, especially alfalfa or red clover, is quite high. So you can see here, it's going to remove in every ton of dry matter 45 to 70 pounds of potassium. So some really high producing alfalfa fields in Vermont are 5 tons of dry matter. That's a lot of potassium. So if you have fields that have way too much potassium in it, grow alfalfa, you'll definitely bring it down, okay, really quickly if you have a good stand. But if you're trying to grow it and you're not supplying enough potassium, you can also weaken the stand really, really quickly because it requires so much. So grasses also need a lot of potassium, not as much as legumes or alfalfa, but it is better at scavenging potassium because of its root system, right? It's more fibrous, where alfalfa has that big taproot and red clover has that taproot. So if you're trying to grow a mixed stand, the grasses are going to be able to get the potassium more easily than the alfalfa. They're better competitors for it, okay? So you have to be really careful, because if you're not fertilizing those stands properly, you definitely will lose the legume pretty quickly if you're not supplying enough potassium to the fields, okay? So you have to just watch out for that if you're trying to grow a mixed stand. All right. Now, potassium is a really interesting nutrient. because it functions a little bit differently than others in the plant. I mean, they all do different things, but how the plant takes it up is really different. So there are 3 different approaches, and we use potassium as an example to explain this because of the nature of the nutrient itself. So when we're looking at our soil tests, when we did that a couple of weeks ago, there was a recommendation on the soil test. Remember that? It showed us everything that was in the soil or whatever it was measuring. And then on the bottom, it says, if you're growing grass, you need 100 pounds of this and 20 pounds of that and 50 pounds of this. So how did we come up with those? So there's kind of 3 approaches that are used to make recommendations. So one is called the sufficiency approach. The second is called the maintenance approach. And then the third is the soil cation balance approach. Okay. So remember, right? Calcium, magnesium, potassium are cations. So balancing those on the soil. Remember, I just said if there's too much of one thing, it can be bad. So the sufficiency approach is based on maintaining a critical soil level of exchangeable K. So that's where you guys see those graphs that are produced on your soil test where it says optimum, low, medium, very high. So it's the sufficiency approach is making sure that we maintain that soil test level in that optimum range. We want to have enough available in the soil to meet your crop needs. The maintenance approach is doing what I just did a second ago. Oh, can I go back to a second ago? Right here, where I said, if you're removing 5 tons of dry matter of alfalfa, you're removing 350, is that right? Yeah, 350 pounds of potassium. So the maintenance approach would be, I'm going to add that back. Yikes, that's a lot of potassium. Okay, but that's the maintenance approach that some people actually use, which can be really expensive and it's not what you should do. Just giving you the example here. Okay. All right, so go back here. So that's the maintenance approach. We took it away. Now we got to put the same amount back. And then there's the cation balance approach, which is saying that we want some certain percentage of all those negative binding sites on the soil to have potassium. And we want some certain percentage to have calcium and some certain percentage to have magnesium, right? And we talked about this when we talked about soil tests, that we look at these saturation levels to help us make recommendations. But this is not the only thing that we should use because, well, it doesn't account for phosphorus, doesn't account for nitrogen. And sometimes you may be in a soil type that just has a ton of calcium. So you have to deal with it in a different way, right? So the best thing, and what UVM does, maybe that's why it's the best, I don't know. But the best thing to do is to use all 3 because there's valid reasons to combine all these approaches to make a really good recommendation. And I just talked about a couple of those. So the maintenance approach here can be really important. You want to use that to understand what you're removing. And if you have really, really low soil test levels, at least in the minimum, often you want to replace what you've removed. Okay, if you have high soil test levels, that's a whole different story because your soil's already full of nutrients. You're actually trying to draw it down a little bit, right? You don't want to just keep adding back that much more, okay? But in some cases, it actually is more economical to use a maintenance approach depending on the nutrient. And we'll do this sometimes with phosphorus. We talked about it in that regard as well, because we're often over applying phosphorus. So we have to only apply it to what the crop removes. And then with the soil cation balance approach, I just talked about the implications sometimes of having too much potassium on those binding sites. You can end up with metabolic disorders in your animals and also in your plants. So paying attention to all three of these and using those to make good recommendations is what we do, okay? So sufficiency level, like I said, is where you look at your soil test and here you are, you're in optimum. So we know that there's plenty there to supply your crop with what it needs. If you were way down here, you know, we want you to get up here. But again, sometimes that's very expensive and not practical. So then we might want to use the maintenance approach. So when can the maintenance approach be really bad? And that's what I just talked about with potassium. So the interesting thing about potassium is that plants, especially grasses, will luxury consume it. It's actually one of the only nutrients it will do that with. A lot of nutrients like nitrogen, as an example, the crop will only take up so much, and then adding any more is just a waste. With potassium, it doesn't know when to turn off the switch. So it'll just keep taking it up and making those plants and your crops really high in potassium. There's no shut-off switch. So again, you can run in a lot of trouble if you went and looked at the potassium level in your grass in the bunk and calculated how much it removed and then put that back. Because it could have just taken up way more than it actually needed. So using that kind of approach with potassium can be really dangerous and expensive. So you have to, you know, only use that type of approach with certain nutrients. Oops, so there you can see, this is what it required for growth. And then this is the amount that it will luxury consume. It'll just keep going. So you can quickly lose money. Here's just another example. I was sort of talking about this earlier at, if you used replacement value only, and you had 5-ton optimum yield of alfalfa, if your alfalfa was 2%, you would be removing 240 pounds of potassium. If it was 3%, you would be removing 300 pounds. That's a big difference, but that's, you know, what crops do with potassium. They just take up more than what they need. So we have to manage that. All right. So again, there's lots of sources of potassium available for us, you know, whether you're organic or conventional. So it's a little bit easier to access than like nitrogen, especially if you're organic. So there's muriate of potash, which is a conventional source of potassium, but there's also a what is it? It's not potassium sulfate. There's Sopomag that's available organic. And there's another one too that's a 0052, which is an organic source. So you are able to access some decent sources of potassium if you're organic besides manure. All right, so how do we minimize luxury consumption? So if your soil test says you need 200 pounds of potassium, you don't want to go out and put that all on at one time, because the plants are just going to take up as much as they can, basically till you harvest it. And then what's left will likely be lost. Okay, so you want to do split applications to reduce that type of luxury consumption. And then even more so on sandy soils, because it's so prone to leaching. Adding additional potassium. So if you do have potassium recommendations, you definitely want to do that after first cut, not before. And then usually later in the summer, okay? And that's again to help sort of spread out that luxury consumption. In the springtime, potassium levels are at its highest. And that's because a lot of the potassium through freezing and thawing and warming of the soils gets released off of those like hard to exchange sites. and also gets released from the soil. So you generally have the absolute most potassium you will likely have in the spring. So going out and adding everything else in the spring is just going to lead to way too much potassium in your crops. And you probably already had too much to begin with because of that. Okay, if you're liming can also increase exchangeable potassium because you're adding calcium, remember, and it kicks off the other nutrients once you put the calcium in. So it'll kick the potassium off, and that will become available to your crop. All right. So potassium generally goes down throughout the season, which is good to know, right? Because you have the most in the spring in that first cut. So you can try to manage your feed that way too. And then it should go down over the season. And that's why the better times, if your soil test says you need it, are to apply after first cut. And then you can see the other nutrients become more available as the season progresses as well. And again, this is why in the spring, especially when you're grazing, you can have really low magnesium levels causing grass tetany when you put the animals out on pasture. So the other thing to mention again is, too much potassium leads to lower levels of these other nutrients in your feed. We kind of already talked about that, oftentimes leading to issues with, milk fever and other metabolic issues that you'll have to deal with. So just making sure to put on only what you need, trying to reduce that luxury consumption. And again, this just basically goes back to what I was talking about in continuing to add more and more nitrogen because you think that is the deficiency you're seeing, and not taking care of potassium, you're not going to increase your yields, right? It actually, I don't want to say necessarily will hurt your yields, but it could, because potassium and nitrogen sort of go hand in hand into the plant. So here's not putting on any potassium and putting on a lot of nitrogen. You can see the yield response. There isn't anything, right? It's low. Putting on adequate amounts of potassium and adequate amounts of nitrogen are going to give you better yields. Okay. So this really goes back to understanding the soils, the soil test, and providing what the crops need. Okay. And if it says it needs potassium in a big way, you need to put it on. You can't, well, you can, and people do. Most people just choose to put the nitrogen on, but it's not one or the other. You got to have both to maximize yields. So for whatever that's worth, do it all to the best of your ability and the size of your wallet. Yeah, it's small. Yeah. All right. And again, especially with grass in particular, the amount of potassium that we've seen, and this is old data from the when UVM had a forage testing lab, but you can see it can vary quite considerably, up to 5% in some forages. So, it's kind of all over the board. You really want it down here, around 2% or less. But this is where you run into issues up here metabolically. So again, other things that influence how much potassium is in your feed is stage and maturity of the grass. The more mature it gets, the less potassium there is, which is not good for anybody because you want high quality feed for your cows. But it can reduce the amount of potassium overall as the grass begins to head out. And again, time of the year, we already talked about that. Early in the spring, you tend to have the most potassium. I would say it's also the time where we tend to harvest late because of the weather. So sometimes it works itself out, right? And the forage type and species. So pastures can be really, really high in potassium because they're really lush and vegetative, usually very leafy when we go out and graze. So again, we have to watch out for that, especially because the other nutrients may not be taken up in sufficient amounts. And then you can see legumes tend to be between 2 and 3%, or they should be. And grasses also should be around 2%, 2.5%. And corn silage is pretty low. We usually don't worry about that too much. Forage species, so selecting certain grasses, doesn't really have a huge effect on potassium. Most species, really take up potassium to the same levels, more or less. Except for reed canary, but you shouldn't grow that anyway. All right. Oh, we already talked about that. I think we're done. That was it. Wow, that was short. What else can we talk about? What time is it? We have more. Don't worry. I know you were maybe worried that we weren't going to go on for hours today, but corn stalk testing is really for nitrogen. Yeah, not for potassium. Are there any questions on potassium?
Do they have soil probes that can go out in the field and test?
No, there's no in-season test, if that's what you were wondering. Yeah, it's very different than nitrogen. We do have an in-season test for nitrogen. Don't worry, I have more. I know, you're worried, not worried. You were happy.
No.
Isn't that referred to like a CSNT test?
A CSNT is, yes, the stock nitrate test. And those are end of season tests.
Okay.
So you're really using those to determine if you put on too much nitrogen or not enough. And, they're good. It's more information, right? But every year's different. So something that you normally do in a year where it's really dry and we didn't get a lot of leaching, let's say, of nitrogen, you may end up with really high corn stalk nitrate tests. And then in a year where it's wet, maybe pretty low. But again, it's a tool to help gauge if you're way over the top or just about right. Cornell, I think Dairy One does those. Lindsay, do you know the corn stalk nitrate test?
Yes.
Dairy One. Okay, yeah, we've taken them a bunch, and the information is always useful at the end. But the in-season test, the pre-sidedress nitrate test, I think is more useful in real time. So the pre-sidedress nitrate test, you go out before you're going to top dress. And this is really most useful, I think, for dairy farmers or any farmer that's really growing a row crop that uses manure, or like a plowed down crop or a plowed down sod or something like that. Because it's hard to predict, as hopefully you guys learned last week, it's hard to predict nitrogen. So going out right before what we call the rapid uptake time for a crop, which is, essentially when it's about knee high, it starts to go into this rapid growth mode. It's like the teenager mode, right? Where they eat so much and then they're growing. But that's what the crop does, the same thing. So if you go out and you take essentially a soil test, use the same probe, you stay in between the rows of corn. You don't want to get in any place where you maybe put starter fertilizer, and you go in and you take soil probes across the field about a foot deep, put them in the refrigerator right away. Because remember last week we talked, if you put a bag of soil on the front seat of your truck or like on the dash and it's hot, the microbes are going to just go nutty. And they're going to consume all the organic matter, and they're going to take all the nitrogen and it'll dissipate. So you want to keep the sample cool and call Jeff and he'll come pick it up. Actually, we usually go out and do them and get them to the lab. And they process the samples generally within 24 hours. So you want to try to take it as close to when you actually be putting fertilizer on. And it measures nitrates. So if you remember from last week, we talked about nitrates being what the crop wants to take up. So it measures the level of nitrates in the soil at that moment and says, will you have enough to make it through for whatever ton corn you want to achieve, right? So if it's 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, it'll give you a recommendation. So it'll say, you have enough here for 15-ton corn, but if you want 25-ton corn, you need to put on 50 more pounds or 60 or nothing. And again, as we talked last week, that nitrate could be lost pretty quickly if all of a sudden it just started raining for weeks on end. So I personally feel like it's the best thing we have, and it's cheap, and it's especially with $700 ton fertilizer prices. Why the hell wouldn't you go out there for $12 and figure out if you actually need to buy more fertilizer, or how much more should you buy, instead of just saying, well, I normally do this, so that's what I'm going to do. And I think that really, it's an excellent tool, and you have to know how to interpret it, because sometimes it'll say 0 and people freak out. Nobody's ever happy about that. I would think people would be really happy. You'd be like, yes.
Does it measure how many growing 3 days?
It doesn't, right? So there's limitations, but if you take a soil sample and there's 100 parts per million of nitrates and the sufficiency level is 25, you have a lot of nitrate in the soil. Like, the chances of losing that much is pretty slim. If you take the test and you're at 25 parts per million, and that's a sufficiency level, I would probably still go out and do a little bit, right? I would say, yeah, we'll probably lose some. I'd go out and fertilize, likely, depending on the year. So, but it's good stuff. But you got to be on it. We're mostly on it, halfway. 3, not even. Don't give us that much credit. Jeff is. No, usually it's like, oh my gosh, it's like we just get done one thing, as you guys do, and say, oh my gosh, we got to get out there and start doing PSNT tests. Yes, don't call on July 4th or 3rd. When July 4th on a Friday. It is like all labs, they do close on the weekends. And although UVM, the person that runs the UVM lab, he's usually during PSNT season, he will be in the lab all weekend, unless it's the 4th of July. Yeah. Okay, here we go. Let's just, because we should talk about micronutrients, and people always ask about them. What does that say? 1, 2, 3. I know I'm older. I would say old. I used to make fun of people that would use the same slides that you saw 20 years ago. I have arrived. I'm using the same slides that somebody else used 20 years ago, and now I'm using the same slides. So they're officially about 40 years old now. I think that's Jeff Carter. If anybody knew Jeff, or Craig Eltamos, one of them. Jeff's retired. I took Craig's place. So, and I've been here 20 years now. Anyway, plus that soil looks awful. We need a better picture. I'll try to upgrade that in 10 years or so. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So again, we already went over this. Primary macro, you need a lot of them. Your crop needs a lot of them. Secondary macronutrients, they tend to be more plentiful in the soil: calcium, magnesium, sulfur. And then you have the micronutrients. We already talked about this. You don't need a lot of them, but you need them. They're essential. Okay, so we've got to have all of these, just in really small amounts. So similar to the macronutrients we talked about, micronutrients have these charges as well, sort of negative and positive charges. So boron, which is just generally considered deficient in Vermont soils, generally across the board. We recommend boron if you're growing alfalfa, any kind of legume, okay? Just blanket recommendation. Because you can see it has this negative charge. And so it gets lost in the soil really, really easily the minute it becomes available. It doesn't stick onto the soil, okay? So we're constantly battling having enough boron, not for grasses per se, but for legumes. They take a lot of it. And same with molybdenum, which who's ever put on molybdenum? Who can say it, for God's sakes, let alone it's like a tongue twister. But it also has a negative charge, and it's another nutrient that legumes need. So as I mentioned before, generally with what you're feeding your cattle, regardless of what they are, most people are feeding minerals, right? And those minerals contain many of these things that your animals need, and they barely utilize what they're getting, what you're feeding them as far as minerals go. And most of it comes out the back end. If you look at your manure test, it will show not all, but many of the micronutrients that are in the manure. Okay. So for the most part, if manure is going on a field and somewhat regularly, and it's not beach sand, you usually have enough nutrients, with the exception of boron on legumes. So if you are purchasing, and this is where it gets difficult, if you're not buying potassium, let's say for your alfalfa or whatever legume you're trying to keep in the stand, how are you going to get on a pound of boron per acre, right? So one source of micronutrients that has been sort of popular, I would say up here more so than other places, has been wood ash. We see a lot of it's kind of popular down where we are too, but wood ash has a lot of micronutrients in it. Anything that was in the wood that was burned, that, not carbon, is left. And so there's a lot of micronutrients in wood ash. It has quite a bit of boron, quite a bit of molybdenum, quite a bit of manganese. It also has a good amount of potassium, calcium. So it's almost a complete fertilizer for legumes. So I hear, and maybe we even talked about this already, people saying, I used that wood ash once, I couldn't believe the clover. Well, that's why you gave it what it wanted. So wood ash can be a really good source of micronutrients as well as other nutrients too. All right, this is a lot of stuff, but it's just really showing you the micronutrients and what crops. Nobody's here is growing beets, or maybe somebody's growing beets, but you can see alfalfa has high need for boron. Corn has a high need for zinc. And as a result, if you're in Vermont, you should be evaluating if you need zinc for your corn. Don't always. Soybeans, wheat and oats are high level of manganese, pasture legume grasses, boron and molybdenum. So some species require higher levels of micronutrients than others, okay? And we've tried to address that in Vermont, really, mostly through boron recommendations and zinc recommendations. All right. And again, they're essential. They're critical to lots of plant functions, like really important ones, like this one, photosynthesis. Everybody knows that. I think that was actually my son's first word. Sorry. Might have been. Probably it wasn't, but. So photosynthesis, all these really protein development, so critical. So we can't ignore them. But again, with micronutrients, it doesn't take long to go from sufficient to toxic, right? Because you just need such a little amount. So definitely, if the recommendation is for 1 pound, don't say, well, I could get on 200, right? You're going to have some pretty severe issues, like plant death. So how do you know if you should add them? Soil tests, we do blanket recommendations for boron if you're growing legumes. You're going to see a recommendation. Zinc, you will need to make your own recommendation. The zinc level is on the soil test. There are methods to make those in your book, which I can show you. You don't always need zinc, okay? So don't just be adding it because you always do. It does cost money. Okay? And manganese is another one. We can tell a little bit more from a soil test. But a lot of these, the best way to diagnose, issues or if you need them is through plant analysis. And usually it's not done till it's too late and you see issues. So then you start taking tissue tests to understand what's going on. So when would you add these? And again, if the crop requirement is high from a little table and your soil test is low and you haven't had, levels of manure going on those fields. And if you have high, or if you have low clay soils or sandy soils. So again, here are some soil conditions where we see micronutrient deficiencies. So sand, low organic matter, dry, but sandy again, and no manure. All right, that's one important piece here. Magnesium deficiencies, just some pretty pictures when things aren't going right. We already talked about magnesium. And again, if you have way too much potassium, you can run into magnesium deficiencies. If your soil test says to add magnesium, add it. There's a reason. We don't see it that often, but if you see it, you should be adding it. All right, we already talked about all this. I think that's the only new things that I had to show you. We already did all that. See, I didn't even update these.
Gee.
I know, lazy. Sulfur, so there's been some concern around sulfur. Does anybody remember acid rain? When that was a big, huge concern and all of Mount Mansfield was dead. The top of it from acid rain. Anybody I remember writing papers on it when I was in high school, right? Or grade school, acid rain. Well, we cleaned up our act, so there's not a lot of acid rain anymore, but it used to deposit a lot of sulfur on our fields. And so there has been this concern that now we've cleaned up the amount of sulfur in the rain and in the air that we're going to be sulfur deficient. Again, I haven't seen a ton of sulfur deficiency because we put on a lot of manure, but it does happen. And you might have seen some of this before, that sort of striping. You have to be careful because, sometimes you'll see these things, they'll be really variety specific. It's not a nutrient deficiency, but you can easily overcome sulfur deficiencies by using ammonium sulfate instead of urea as an example. All right. Zinc. So zinc, this is a zinc deficiency in corn. I often see this in fields. Again, we can look at your soil test. It is pretty common around the state if you're not paying attention to it. Yeah, some more zinc. You can't see that one very good. All right, I think that's it. Boron deficiency. You probably see this quite often out on your clover fields too. You'll see the reddening around the margins of the leaves. What I often see this out in alfalfa fields, it looks yellow here. Need to go out and really look because you actually could have leafhopper damage, not a boron issue. So I see this a lot. If somebody grows alfalfa, potato leafhoppers have probably been our biggest insect issue in clover and legume fields in the last 5 years. I don't know if anybody's seeing their alfalfa turn yellow. This is leafhoppers. And it's been bad. In the last 5 years, we've had a couple really significant outbreaks. So, all right. Some more pretty pictures. Oh, there's the leafhopper right there. So leafhopper causes this V-shaped necrosis, hopper burn it's called. And it looks kind of similar to this from a distance. But when you get up close, you flip over those leaves, they'll be covered with little jumpy insects. But leafhoppers are, like I said, they've wiped out a lot of alfalfa fields across the state over the last few years. So grow leafhopper resistant alfalfa. It's not a GMO either, if you're worried about that. Okay, let's call it quits. I'm tired. I'm sick of talking. Are you cheering? Don't cheer. It's so
I didn't say
rude.
anything.
I was in my head.
Okay.
I'll just show you some more pictures of manganese deficiency. Ooh. There we go. All right. I want to say I've seen it all, but I haven't really. And I can actually say I've been here for 20 years and I've seen a lot of things, interesting things, things I've said I've never seen that before. But I rarely see severe micronutrient deficiencies in most of our forage crops. Boron, I'll see that. I'll see zinc. I've seen manganese deficiencies once, and molybdenum once. So, you know, again, if you're using plenty of manure, which most people tend to, you don't have really light textured soils, it's not often a huge concern. All right. It's got to be lunchtime now. Oh my gosh, what is going on with me today?
I don't know.
Only 11:38? Okay, well, I guess now we can talk about our homework and then we're off the hook for the rest of the day, right?
Yeah, that sounds
Okay, we're talking homework now. All right, so this week, I'm muted. No, I'm on now. I unmuted. Yep, no, I saw that. Thank you. Okay, so this week we need to put in nutrient sources. So when you go log into GoCrop and you're on your dashboard up where the farm is. Oops, why'd I press that? There we go. It says dashboard, nutrient sources and equipment. So if you hit nutrient sources, this is where you're going to add your manure and your fertilizers. Okay, this freshwater source is for irrigation, which I don't think anybody's doing that, so you don't need that. Okay, so what's a manure source? That would be a manure pit, right? Any place you're storing manure. So it could be a stack, could be a pile. Stack and a pile are the same thing.
Yep.
Okay, stack, a pile, a pit. Just you've stored manure. You have a stored manure and there's a calculated volume of manure. Okay. So to add a manure source, you can see I already have one in here. Let's get rid of me. Goodbye. There we go. Just like that. Okay. Yeah, you didn't know it was that easy. Okay. So I already have one manure source in here and you might only have one. You may have one pit, you may have two, you may have three, who knows? You may have a pit and a stack, whatever. You need to get them in there. And each source of manure is supposed to have its own manure test. So if you have a pit, you should have a manure test for that each year. That's a requirement. If you have a stack of manure or compost pile, you need to have a manure analysis for that. So you need on a yearly basis, each manure storage sampled and tested for nutrients. Now, hopefully, having been sitting here for several weeks now, you're not going to ask me why you need to test what's in your manure. Somebody asked me that a few weeks ago and I'm like, okay. right? So we're trying to figure out what's the nutrient value of the manure on your farm. So then we can apply it to the fields and feed your crops and get the most out of it. If we don't know what's in there, well, it's just a shot in the dark. There are lots of extra materials today because there was a custom manure applicator training on sampling manure, requirements, record keeping. So if you guys want any of that, you're welcome to help yourselves. But taking the test, I would say this is one of the areas that we haven't done so well with as farmers. You guys have done really great getting on a soil test schedule and doing that. And everybody's been helping with that, the districts, extension, individuals, but remembering to get that manure sample seems to sort of be the thing that we miss out on. So how many people have a current manure analysis? Meaning like it was took in 2022. Everybody?
I haven't got it printed out.
You don't have it? Okay, good.
Get taken.
All right, well, now you have to do it every year. So you should have one for 2023, okay?
I think so. Is there one in there?
Yeah. And again, generally, we definitely have people that come through class that didn't get one. And I mean, I understand it. There's a lot going on. You're busy. But it is really useful to know what's in there. And we do have book values that we can use, but the requirement, which is now a regulation, is that you're supposed to have your own manure test from your manure store, each manure storage every year. And, if you take the sample, and this happens a lot, and it looks really weird, like there's 50 pounds of nitrogen in your liquid manure, that's probably not correct. So, we just got to try again. But the point is, you're trying to get a handle on what kind of nutrients are in the manure on your farm. And it does differ clearly from farm to farm. If you're a grass-fed dairy and you're not feeding any grain, the nutrient content of your manure is going to be very, very, very different than a farm that is feeding grain. Quite different. So using the book values in that case are probably they're really not accurate, not even close. Okay, so having your own manure test is really helpful. And then the more you do it, you can see that in general, they should be pretty close every year, unless you're doing something really different. Sometimes we'll have a really dry year, so there's not as much water. That happens for sure. Or a really wet year. But in general, the manure tests should look somewhat similar, each year. They shouldn't be too different. And really, we're using a year-old test for the next year's planting, right? So what you sampled out of your pit in 2022, hopefully is similar to what you're actually planning to do in 2023. So the more samples you have, the more confidence you can build in those numbers. And when you have an off year, you can say you have an off year. Okay, so you add in a manure source. It's pretty simple. You just say add. It's thinking a lot. Whew. Coffee. Wow, that's the slowest I've seen Go Crop run actually in a long time. Okay. Because, there we go. Just about when I was done waiting.
Kind of kick it.
Yep. Okay, so you need to give the manure source a name. I already have one called Big Pit, Little Pit. Or no, Little Stack. Okay, how long has the source been there? Just whatever. That's, again, not overly important. Is it imported? So
From Mexico.
from Mexico. If you are spreading chicken manure, you're getting poultry manure from somewhere, Pete and Jerry's, Drew's, you're gonna want to include that as an imported manure source, okay? And then you're gonna spread it on the fields that you spread it on. For most people, right? No, this is not imported. What is the animal type? So this is a stack. I'm gonna say it's coming from the heifers. There we go. And then ask you what the manure type is. So is it liquid manure, semi-solid, or solid? So I'm gonna say this is solid. And then it asks you, well, how much is there? 10 pounds? No. Okay. You should, the conservation district or land treatment planner, whoever you're working with, hopefully was able to help calculate a production number for you. And I know for some farms, this is a little bit difficult. I know one of the farms Cindy's working with is a deer farm. So it's a little bit harder for us to come up with some numbers there, and then they compost it, and you know, there's special things that are going on, but we try to help you put together a production number. How much manure is produced on your farm, and waste, right? And the bedding, water if it's a pit, and try to come up with a number for you to go off from, okay? So let's just say I've got 200 wet tons. So then I'm gonna save it. And then it wants the manure value. So then you add in the manure test information. 20% dry matter. All this should come off from your manure test. Okay. So one thing that people often mess up on, if you haven't done this yet, when you get your manure test out, it starts with total nitrogen. You do not put total nitrogen here. Okay, it starts with ammonium nitrogen. A lot of times people just go down the list. So they put in the total nitrogen and then it messes it up. So just a heads up there. Now I'm going to say 7 pounds of organic N, 4 pounds of phosphorus, 10 pounds of potassium. Okay, so again, I'm making this up, but you should have your manure test. And it's already in pounds per wet ton. That should be the right unit if you're, you know, if you have solid manure. If it's liquid and you hit liquid, it will come up as pounds per 1,000 gallons. Okay, semi-solid tends to be the one that people have a little trouble with, but then you just save it and that's it. Okay, so you add in all of your manure sources and you're done. Pretty simple. So then the next thing you want to add in is your fertilizers. So if you're buying fertilizers, then you'll add those in here. So if you're purchasing urea, or you're putting on fish emulsions, or I don't know what everybody's doing, but some kind of commercial fertilizer or purchase fertilizers, you would put them here. So I already put some examples in here. Whoop. So down here, I put in 3 fertilizers. I have a corn starter that's a liquid, and the analysis is 918.9. I have cheap, that's bagged chicken manure I'm buying. And it's got an analysis of 543. And I have a grass top dress I'm using, which is 4600. So you can call it whatever you want. You can call this urea, call this chicken poop, whatever. But you know, call it something that you know, again, what it'll be. And then you put the analysis in. So if you're, you know, just top dressing your grass, or you have some special fertilizer you use when you seed down, whatever it is, you're going to want to put it in here. So let me I'll edit this one. So you can see you put in the name. Is it liquid, gas, or dry? You're really, for everybody here, it'd be liquid or dry. Okay. Then it asks you a question. If this is not a synthetic fertilizer, please choose one or more of the following. So what does that mean? This is if you're buying some kind of organic based, not necessarily certified organic, but organic based, it was once living type of fertilizer. So it could be fish or poultry or alfalfa pellets or soybean meal or something that you're putting on the fields that is not a synthetic fertilizer. Okay. Then you would check, or if it's biosolids, you check one of those boxes. Okay. And you update it. Once you add it in, you have to go back in and add the analysis. Okay, so you just add in the amount of N, P, and K. If your starter fertilizer has zinc in it, as an example, you can select zinc. And then whatever the percentage is, it's usually a lot less than that, but let's just say 0.5. Okay, you add that in. Now for liquid, you have to put the density. The common density is already in here. So don't change it unless you know the fertilizer has a different density. And then you update it or you add it. All right. So let's go. I'm going to go to organic one. So cheap is a bag chicken manure. And so when I go in here and it asks me if it's an organic amendment, I checked yes, it is. And then when I go into the fertilizer analysis, I put in the analysis, and then below it says, what is the nitrogen mineralization rate? So you learned last week that organic nitrogen has to be broken down by microbes to become available. And that's a slow process. Okay. So this is saying, this is organic nitrogen. How much of that 5% is going to become available to your crop? Is it all of it? 5% of it, 25, 30, 50? I would say on average, which is why this is in here, only 30% of the organic N in most of these products becomes available. Okay. So if you are buying something like this, you're not going to get all of the nitrogen, just like manure. I mean, it's an organic based fertilizer. Okay, so that's all pretty straightforward. The other thing you need to add in is your manure spreaders. So, yep, you just add a spreader. It's only for manure spreaders. That's the only thing you're putting in. And this is really for record keeping. And also, when you finish your plan, you can get a manure report that will say, on field X, you're putting on X number of gallons per acre, and that's 3 loads with this spreader or 2 loads with that spreader. But when you're keeping your records and you're out spreading manure and you're in GoCrop on your device and you're like, I want to record that I'm putting manure on this field, then you say, I'm using this spreader and I put on this many loads. Okay. So it basically helps you to calculate what your rates are per acre. So you can put in your spreaders. Now, if you don't spread your own manure, and like Kelly View comes and does it as an example, you put their spreaders in. Okay. And then asks you, is it calibrated? Well, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah.
Definitely. So you say yes. And then the size of the spreader, the type, is it a solid spreader, etc. Is it custom or not? All right. That's that. That's the easy part. That shouldn't, it took us 15 minutes, 19. That's not all of it though. Yeah. Are you ready for the next part? It's gonna get big. Okay. So this week you need to go into your fields. So now you've put in all the soil information, the soil test information. You put in what crops you're growing, you put in the Russell 2 numbers, right? The erosion rate, you got your rotations in there. Now you need to go to nutrient planning. Okay, so we filled out all these other tabs, hopefully. And now we're going to go to nutrient planning. Okay, so I'm in the big field. And when I go into nutrient planning, if you have your soil test information, if everything is in there, soil test, crop you're growing, yields, it's going to make a recommendation for you. Okay, you don't have to type one in, there should be one in there. That's why it's important you put the right crop in. Okay, so this is a grass field. It says I need 160 pounds of nitrogen, and I don't need any phosphorus, and I don't need any potassium, but I need lime. Okay. All right. So where am I going to get that from? Let's start with past years. Okay. So most people on most of the fields, you put manure on last year, right? So on my hay field, I put manure on this field in 2022. So to put in past year's manure, you hit on past years, it gives you two options, 2022 and 2021. Now I'm going to preface this by saying it's your first year of your plan. If you choose not to put in past year manure applications this year, we're going to let it ride. But next year, because you're going to be keeping records in GoCrop, you will be taking credit for last year's manure applications. I'm hoping you remember that the manure nitrogen breaks down over time. So you get some in year 1, some in year 2, and some in year 3. Okay. So in here, when I hit past year's manure, it'll say, or past year credits. Are you going to get credit from your crop, or are you going to get credit from the manure you applied? Right? We're going to go through an example with crops in a minute. But for your hay fields, you're not going to get any credit from last year's hay, right? Just, you're not. But from last year's manure, you will get some nitrogen. So if you want to add that in this year, you can. And I did an example here. So it says, do you want to use crop data from, do you want, down here in manure, do you want to use manure application data from 2022? So again, if you are using GoCrop to keep records, you could say, yes, I want to use that data. And then it'll automatically calculate this for you. But you don't have any data in here. So you can say, I'm going to use an estimate. So then it asks you, well, what kind of manure did you put on? Well, I put on liquid manure. And how much did you put on during the growing season? What is the growing season for grass normally? When would the grass be taking up manure nutrients that you've put on normally? Till October 1st, let's say, normally, roughly.
Oh,
Well, that's the way it is. Yeah, I shouldn't have asked.
Yeah.
It's it. So any manure that you put on from April, whenever the spreading ban is lifted, through September, okay, is last year's manure. Any manure that was applied last fall, October through December 15th, is not last year's manure, last crop's manure. It's this crop's manure. Is that right? So if you're putting manure on the field in October, you're not going to get much from that for 2022's crop because you're done cropping. that manure will be for 2023. This is why this is optional. Okay, so this is manure that you put on the field from April through September of 2022. So I put on 8,000 gallons. I applied manure in June and August. So I put on 8,000 gallons, and then it says, what was the organic N of that manure? Now we're really pushing it, right? So you pull out your manure test and it's 13 pounds. So then you update that. And it says you're going to get 12 and a half pounds of nitrogen for this year's crop. Alrighty, good. So next we want to add in manure from this year. So, or for this year's crop. So this is going to include any manure you put on last fall, okay? And any manure you plan to put on this spring and summer. So you hit that little arrow there. And I said on this hayfield, I'm going to put on manure in early June. You have to put some kind of time frame, putting on 3,000 gallons out of the big pit. I'm going to spread again in July after second cut, and then again in September after third cut. And you can see it all shows up here. So to apply manure, you just hit add plan manure. This will pop up. You put in an approximate time frame. Where are you going to take it from? Big pit or little stack? It's going to come from big pit. And then what rate? Okay. And then it asks you if it's incorporated or not. Well, this is a hay field, so it's not, right? So then I update it. Okay, so what I want you to do is to go in and add the manure that you would normally put on those fields. Okay, so if you're applying manure 2 times, 3 times, put that on. So what you can see here is that I put on an application, or I said I'm going to apply again in October of 2023. And you can see it's grayed out because it says it's not going to count for this year. Right? We already talked about this. Like this application will go to next year's crop. All right. So that's how much nutrients I'm getting from the manure. Getting 87 pounds of nitrogen, 88 pounds of phosphorus, and 220 pounds of potassium. Okay, and this is what I needed. 160, nothing. So now it says, here's what I've gotten in total. I also went in and added some fertilizer. You do it the same way, right? Go in. When are you putting it on? What fertilizer are you using? What's the rate? How are you going to put it on? You know, ask you a bunch of questions. Update. Okay. So with everything I've done, I still am short 14 pounds of nitrogen, but I've over applied phosphorus and I've over applied potassium. Okay. So what does anybody remember about over applying these nutrients? Is it important that we understand anything here besides the fact we put on too much? That pesky P index. So this is going way back to that first or second class, I guess the second class. So it says the P index here is 68 and is medium. So you can click here and it'll bring you into the P index and you can look at it. What is going on here? Okay. So it says most of my loss from phosphorus is coming in surface dissolved P, which is basically phosphorus in water. Okay. Is there anything I can do to reduce that? Not really. I don't have much soil loss. I've got my buffer. So the only thing I can really do is reduce the amount of manure that I'm putting on. So I'm gonna go back here. Okay. So if you have a medium P index, you can over apply, but you cannot apply beyond what the crop is gonna remove in that year. So what you want to do is check that. Is 88 pounds more or less than what the crop is going to remove? So hit this little button, show crop removal. And it says that you are above crop removal by 28 pounds of phosphorus, which means you have to reduce the amount of phosphorus you're putting on. This has to be 0. Okay. So the only way to really do that is to reduce the amount of manure that you're putting on. So I'm going to say, well, could really use the manure somewhere else. I'm going to get rid of that one. Now I'm okay. Okay. I'm still over applying based on the soil test, but I'm not above the crop removal rate, which are 2 different things. We've talked about this a few times, right? There's what the crop pulls off in biomass, and there's what's in the soil. And right now, when you have too much phosphorus and you're at a medium risk of losing it, you cannot put on more than what the crop is going to remove in that year, because that's going to keep the soil from building up. And you're already have a soil test level of 9, which is high. So you don't want it to go up anymore anyway. Okay. This is a lot, and I understand that. But this is what you need to do for homework this week. Yeah, you got to go through and plan for each field. Adding manure, and then, if you use fertilizer, adding in your fertilizers. You want to go back and look at the P index. Okay, make sure you're meeting that requirement. If you don't understand what the heck I'm talking about, just go through, get your manure in there, get your fertilizers. We still have 2 more weeks, and that's the point of having 2 more weeks, to work through all of that with you. Okay. If you totally understand what I'm saying, that's what you got to do. You got to look at the P index. Okay, it's low, it's medium, it's high. What do we have to do? Right? But the goal really this week is to just kind of put in what you've been doing. And then we're going to start checking these pieces to make sure you're meeting all the requirements. Now there's one last thing. I know. And we'll go around and show people this also. All right, so I just left the fields and I went into reporting tools. I'm gonna press on the dot. If you haven't been here yet, this is where your plan is coming together, okay? If you go to the manure drawdown, it's going to create a report for you. And it's going to show you the total amount of manure that you had. And as you're applying it to each field, it starts to draw down that amount. Okay. So I said I had 1 million gallons in the big pit. I only have 2 fields, so I'm in trouble. But what you want to look at once you put all the manure on those fields is, did you use up all the manure you had? And if you didn't, either that number is wrong, or you need to go back in and add more manure to the fields, okay? If you look at this and the balance is negative, like you've used more manure than what you said you produced, then again, either this number's wrong, or you think you're putting on 10,000 gallons, but you're actually probably only putting on 8. Again, if you understand what I'm talking about, then that's what we want you to do. If this is completely overwhelming, which it may be, and I understand that, the biggest thing we want you to focus on is getting in the manure onto each field like you normally do. And then we'll start checking all these pieces next week so that we can say, you don't have that much manure, or you have a lot more than you think, or your P indexes, we got to do something about that. Okay, that's why we have 2 more classes. We should probably eat lunch, huh? Yeah. Give our brains a rest. And once you get all that done, we're done.
How do you add them more back in? Like, 'cause
You have to
okay,
go
what's the-
back to the manure source,
Okay.
right? And so this happens.
Well, I was wondering if it like reset, like
No.
after the winter or something.
No.
Okay.
Oh, yes, like, yeah, I see what you're saying. In
So
the
like,
next,
obviously you need to like you need to empty your pit, right, or something.
the pit has to be, the requirement is that you have to have the ability to apply all this manure in each year. So the reason you need to put on you those fall manure applications, which are October 1 to December 15th, is because that comes out of here. When you put on the October 2023 manure, it will not come out of here.
Okay.
It'll start in the next year. Okay? I know, it's a lot. Just, well, we're gonna help you through it. This is the most complicated part. Okay, I think we're wrapping up. I know everybody has folks in their class that can help answer all the questions that are gonna come with this. And yeah, we'll see you next week.